It's an honor and a pleasure to welcome all of you to this year's Harry and Lena Kabikoff lecture. Tonight we're here to remember Harry and Lena Kabikoff. We'll speak about them briefly. And of course to welcome Susan Wexner, who is the force behind the Harry and Bella Wexner Kollel Elyon at Yeshiva. And you could see, you look around, how many of the fine students we have in the Kollel, and it was really wonderful that you got to chat with them and get a sense of some of what we're trying to build.
Yes, very gratifying. Thank you.
You know, Harry Kabikoff, who was called Herschel or Tzvi Bereb Yitzchak, he exemplified what an American Jewish immigrant can be. He was faithful to his family tradition, to the Jewish tradition. Together with his wife Lena, they braved tremendous economic hardship, and they maintained a religious home. It was a home that was sanctified with profound, transcendent purpose. It was a home of Torah study and synagogue involvement. That Kabikoff home in Columbus, Ohio, is where Bella Wexner, alaha shalom, was raised. Bella was one of 5 children in that home. And the home that she was raised in was a home that was known for hachnasas orchim, for welcoming guests. It was a home of very profound Jewish values and a lot of warmth. And Bella Wexner, together with her daughter Susan, over 25 years ago. It's hard to imagine it was that long. Like, it makes me feel very old. Makes me feel very old. But over 25 years ago, the Kollel Elyon was established. And Susan Wexner has been much more than the founder of the Kollel. Susan is an active participant with the yeshiva administration, and it's a great honor that Rabbi Yosef Kolinsky, the dean, himself a graduate of the Wexner Kollel Elyon. Rabbi Kolinsky is here. Rabbi Turk is here. So many members of the yeshiva administration. We're blessed to partner with Susan because you're not a person who's hands off. You founded the Kollel, and you continue to be involved in the Kollel because you want to produce the best possible rabbis. You want that vision which you and your mother, alaha shalom, had, the vision that a successful rabbi has to be a Talmud Chacham, has to be erudite, has to be sensitive, compassionate. That was the vision that you had. The vision is being fulfilled today. You look at all the graduates of the Kollel Elyon, and they are doing exactly what you and your mother, alaha shalom, would have wanted. It could use a teeny bit of tinkering, just a teeny bit. But we're doing everything so well to make you and your mother, alaha shalom, so proud.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that introduction, really for your inspiration, your vision, and your continuing dedication, for which we are also deeply grateful. A year ago today was the pager operation in which the terrorists of Hezbollah in Lebanon were targeted with unbelievable precision and efficacy, and a tremendous blow was delivered that accomplished an incredible and unimaginable amount in the defense of the State of Israel. And commented at the time that it was Parshas Kisavo. Now we are in the immediate aftermath of Parshas Kisavo, which we read just a few days ago, that it was a dual fulfillment of a pasuk that we read in that parsha, of a verse there, where we are told regarding the Jewish people, V'ro kol amei haaretz ki shem Hashem nikra alecha v'yaru mimeka. Literally translated, that all of the nations of the world will see that God is with you, that his name is upon you, and they will fear you, that the nations of the world will see that trying to threaten the Jewish people is not a wise idea, and that God is behind them, and they will learn to be deterred. And on that level, there was an enormous, really unimaginable accomplishment to be able to penetrate that deeply with so much advanced planning and creativity and forethought. There's no question that it accomplished something enormous in terms of deterrence and fear, as that pasuk is indicating. But there's an additional level of interpretation that's equally important, and that is that V'ro kol amei ha'aretz kishem Hashem nikra alecha v'yaru mimeka, that all the nations of the world shall see and shall appreciate that you are the bearers of God's name, of God's message, and they shall learn the fear of heaven from you. They shall learn morality and ethics from you, and that is an equally important interpretation of the verse. And this mission, this operation, not only was it effective in deterrence, but it was precise and targeted in a way that no mission before it ever has been. And in focusing to the greatest degree possible, specifically on the terrorists with such a narrow targeting, and minimizing to the greatest extent possible the damage to anyone else, it was not only a lesson in strategy, it was a lesson in morality, a lesson in ethics, and that interpretation of the verse is equally important. That they learn yira in the sense of fear, but they learn yira in the sense of reverence of God, in the sense of an awareness of morality and ethics. And it's that balance that the Jewish people have always had to deal with when it comes to warfare. They have to, first and foremost, defend their people and protect the nation. And that involves, without a doubt, instilling fear, preferably deterrence beforehand, so that there isn't the need for any further warfare. But doing so in a context of ethics and morality, doing so in a way that shows there is a fear of heaven, and that should be conveyed, and that should be appreciated, and that should be learnt by all the nations of the world. And this is a tradition that goes back to our earliest ancestors. Yaakov, whose name would soon be changed to Yisrael, the name that we bear, and he would receive that name following his engaging in physical conflict. And the Torah tells us that as he prepared for conflict with the armies that he expected of his brother Esau, the Torah tells us, Vayira Yaakov ma'od vayetzer lo, seemingly repetitive language, that he was both very fearful and also very anxious. He had much anxiety together with fear. And the rabbis of the Talmud, Rashi quotes it, pose the question, why do we need to be told both? So yes, he was afraid, he was also anxious. What's the message there? And they teach us that he had two apparently equal concerns. He was afraid of being killed in war, as anyone would be, but he was also afraid that he would have to kill others. And both of those occupied his consciousness as he prepared for war, and both of those he was doing whatever he could to try to avoid, to try to minimize the risks, and that was a dual concern that was present in the ancestor, really the namesake of the Jewish people from the earliest moments. And the commentaries ask, well, it's a surprising concern that he should be so afraid not to kill anyone else. It would have been justified. We have a principle of rodef, that if somebody is trying to kill you, habal hargacha, hashkein v'hargo, if someone is trying to kill you, so then you have both the right and really the responsibility to get up first and to kill in self-defense. So why did he have to worry about that so much? It's a little bit of a strange question, except that the answer is probably important to say out loud. That on the one hand, yes, there is the concern that maybe he would kill those who didn't need to be killed. Maybe he would make a bad judgment call, and therefore he was concerned about that. But even if it wasn't a bad judgment call, the idea that even he would have to kill somebody necessarily and justifiably, it's not something that any Jew wants to do. It's not something that anyone has to have on his conscience, wants to have on his conscience. And therefore, he prepared, did everything he could so that he could avoid that eventuality. And we know that this is a sensitivity that we find throughout, that even the great King David, the author of the Psalms, was told that despite all of his magnificent spiritual character, he wasn't going to be the one to build the temple because dam larov shafachta, because you have spilled much blood, and even though that was necessary, that was justifiable, we seek peace, both in deed and in symbolism, and therefore this edifice, that would be the temple of the Jewish people, had to wait to be built by somebody who didn't have that experience as justified and as necessary as it was. So we have this going back to our earliest traditions. But at the same time, we also have the necessity of warfare, the necessity of defense for sure. And it poses the question of just how do we balance the two? How do we make sure that we are being faithful to both considerations? And how do we understand the whole task of looking at morality in the context of warfare, which by its very nature is a violent and brutal environment, and it seems to be very far removed from moral considerations. So the question of how principles are applied, to begin with, first, the issue of civilian casualties and how those are to be avoided, which is a mission which the IDF has excelled at to a greater degree than any other military in history, both in this conflict and in all of its conflicts. So this, again, is a tradition that goes back to, as we see, to Yaakov Avinu and to all of his adherents and his descendants. And it requires understanding how it is that war can have an ethic to begin with, and how exactly it is that war can operate within any kind of a moral structure. It's a given, not just in Jewish law, but in all of world culture, that war is different, that there are different rules when it comes to war by its very nature. And this is two sides of a coin. On the one hand, soldiers are expected to risk their lives, which is not something we normally require in Jewish law or even permit. The danger that soldiers take on is far greater than that which would allow someone to violate Shabbos or to eat on Yom Kippur or to eat non-kosher food because of the level of danger. And yet, that's expected of soldiers, far greater danger. But in a much more notable way, war obviously involves taking the lives of others. And how that is permitted and how that's understood in any ethical framework is something that requires explanation beyond the simple acknowledgement that war is different. And that's an acknowledgement that, again, every world culture has maintained. It's a comment, for example, the Netziv has in his commentary to the Torah, going back to Parshas Noach, where there is a general directive against murder applied to all of humanity, but the language there makes reference to a man and his brother. And the Netziv comments that it's specifically in a context of brotherhood and a peacetime where these prohibitions apply in full force, but war is different. So how is it that we understand why war is different? We require more of an explanation so that we can know how to apply an ethical system within that. And there are a number of ways to begin to explore that question. How could it be that we come with a whole different framework, a whole different way of looking at things, just because something is labeled war? There has to be more to it. One approach that you find in much of the literature, and that is broadly taken as a given, is the fact that war, by necessity, happens between nations. It doesn't happen between people. And therefore, we have to look at things with a different lens for that reason alone. So if, for example, we assume that we are talking about a defensive war, which by necessity is presumably really the only kind of war that we would be talking about halachically in the modern era, when we're certainly separated from any context of Urim V'Tumim or anything like that. So we're talking really solely about defensive wars in the modern era. So the question of how to view that, even if we take the label of Rodef, of the pursuer, that we mentioned in the context of Yaakov, and apply that here, but normally the rule of Rodef means that one is only permitted to take lethal action against the actual pursuer. So if Ruvain is trying to kill me, so I can defend myself by taking lethal action against Ruvain. But if Shimon is in the way, and Shimon is innocent, so then I have no license to do any harm to Shimon to save my own life. And that's an absolute formalist rule. The Talmud says, Yehareg v'al yavor, I have to sacrifice my life rather than take an innocent life. And the Talmud uses the expression, my chazis, by what logic do I see, what right do I have to assume that my blood is any redder than his? So if Shimon is indeed innocent, I have no right to kill him in order to save my life when Reuven is the one who is the aggressor, who is the pursuer. So how could it be in the context of war, where it's inevitably the case that innocents will be caught up in the crossfire? It's impossible to have a war where that doesn't happen. So how do we allow that to be the case if the rule of Rodef is insufficient to explain it, if these people are not necessarily the actual pursuers? So by necessity, we have to assume that wars are fought between nations, and the strength of the nation in every sense of the word is very relevant to the ability of any nation to wage war, and therefore, by necessity, everyone who's a part of that nation is viewed as one entity, and to that extent, they're all a part of the pursuit. So on the one hand, that does justify and explain a much broader lens when looking at the population as a whole, but it's important to understand the other side of the equation as well, because it limits at the same time as it licenses, and that's a crucial point. When we hear the word Rodef, so we get very concerned because it sounds like a license to kill, and we should be concerned. But to understand that the same principle also comes with a crucial limitation. And the Talmud says that just as one is permitted to use lethal force to defend against a Rodef, that is only if that's what's necessary in order to stop the pursuit. However, if the language is Yachol Hatzilo Be'echad Me'ivarav, if it's possible to stop the pursuit by disabling the pursuer rather than killing him, so then that becomes the obligation. And that's a crucial point to appreciate, that the same principle of Rodef, the same extent to which it licensed, it also limits. It rules that there must be only as much force as necessary in order to stop the assault. And even if we are to nationalize the concept and assume that it's applied to a collective entity rather than an individual, presumably that same principle applies as well. And therefore, a careful calculus would have to be made to the extent possible, and it's by nature a subjective and challenging calculation to make literally under fire. But to whatever extent possible, a calculation would have to be made. What is the minimal force necessary in order to defend, in order to prevent the assault? And this is what much, much later became known as the law of proportionality in international law, which is a vastly misunderstood idea in modern discourse. But international law for warfare requires proportionality. Proportionality does not mean that the defender does the same thing to the attacker that the attacker did to them. God forbid, that would be terrible to assume that Israel should do the same thing to Hamas that Hamas did on October 7th. That would be far from our imagination to ever conceive of such a thing. But what it means is that the effort, the military effort, must be proportionate to the goal. So whatever is necessary in order to stop the threat, and not more than that. So that sense of proportionality is something that is encoded in international law, but it is perhaps a reflection of this understanding of the concept of Rodef. The same principle of the pursuer carries this limitation that it's only allowing as much lethal force as is necessary to stop the pursuit, and therefore it contains that very concept of proportionality in its definition, in its formulation. So that presumably is a major step in understanding how the ethics of warfare are crafted, but I think there's another major element as well. And that is that when it comes to individual behavior in the context of civil law and criminal law, so many of our principles by necessity are subject to formalist rules. And first and foremost among those is murder. So we have a formalist rule when it comes to murder, and that's what's reflected in what we mentioned a few moments ago, the idea of Yehorig Val Yavor. So one is not permitted to kill an innocent person, even to save his own life. And there are many other limitations that make murder an absolute formalist rule. And one is never allowed to make a calculation that the ends justify the means, that it's for the greater good, and I can take this person's life because it's going to come to a better conclusion. As long as that individual is not the actual pursuer, there is no license to do that. That's the formalist prohibition of murder. One is essentially required to give up their life for the system, for the integrity of the system and the morality of the whole. However, that's only a viable approach when dealing with individuals. When dealing with national entities, it's not a practical possibility. You can say that an individual should sacrifice their life for the system. You can't say to a nation to sacrifice its entire life for the system. And therefore, by necessity, once we're dealing with a concept of warfare, which by its very definition puts things on a completely different scale, so then there has to be allowance to a certain degree for a consequentialist morality, for a perspective of the ends justify the means, even if that's not something that we can allow on an individual criminal civil level. So that presumably also explains much of warfare ethics as well, in conjunction with the first principle. But here again, it requires a very careful analysis of what exactly are the ends and the means, and when it is indeed justified, and in fact perhaps an even more careful analysis, because the risk of abuse of such an idea is so easily imaginable. So the tension that has to be placed upon the system is very great, but by necessity one has to imagine that that's also a part of the equation here. So a combination of the two ideas, that war by definition is a national entity against a national entity and seen as the total entity altogether, and also that it has to allow for a certain degree of consequentialism in its assessment, but both of these, the principle of Rodef and the principle of consequentialism, are both going to say that a careful assessment has to be made for proportionality, for what's necessary, for how the mission can be accomplished. In our case, talking about a defensive mission, can be accomplished with a minimum of harm and a maximum of benefit to the world overall. So that idea, the notion that there is a consequentialist approach here, which is different from how individuals make moral decisions, probably could also explain another very difficult concept that exists in the halachic literature regarding war, a concept that's very difficult to understand, that when it comes to warfare, so the halacha recognizes different concepts of war, different categories of war. There is what's known as a milchemes mitzvah. There is a obligatory war, which involves a number of categories of wars described in the Torah, and presumably, as many and most understand, a war that is defensive against a mortal threat from another nation is also classified as a milchemes mitzvah. But it also discusses the concept of a milchemes harishus, which literally would translate to a discretionary war. So the concept of a discretionary war from a moral perspective sounds very difficult to imagine. How could it be that given all of the terrible destruction and moral compromise that emerges from war, how could it be that war could ever be anything than an absolute last resort? How could it be that we could ever imagine anything be considered a discretionary war? And there's a very striking passage in the Talmud at the beginning of Brachos. The Daf Yomi people, even if you only get a few daf in, you see this Gemara. So the Gemara talks about King David allowing a war where it seems like it's even motivated by economic considerations, which is very difficult to understand. So the commentaries explain, Rav Reuven Margolius in the Sefer Margolius Hayam to Sanhedrin, and there's a response to him about this in the Sefer Chemdas Tzvi. They explain that that's not what it looks like. It's not a war for economic considerations, but it's a recognition of the fact that sometimes there are threats to national security that take a longer path, and sometimes they go through economic methods, and therefore they're also defensive in nature, but it takes a different kind of calculation as to how to approach that. And here, what we understand is that this concept of the Milchemes Reshus, which seems like a discretionary war, I don't even know if that translation is really appropriate. I think probably the Reshus refers to the permission necessary in order to assess that the war is appropriate. But it reflects, once again, essentially a defensive move that is of a different kind of nature. So an individual in a civil system doesn't have the right to take a preemptive strike against somebody who he thinks will be trying to kill him tomorrow. That would be a violation of civil law. But if we allowed a consequentialist perspective, so then that may indeed allow for a preemptive strike when there is a credible belief that that may be a potential threat. And presumably this idea of a Milchemes HaReshus is reflective of that. So it's also consistent with that kind of a philosophical framework. So once we have that perspective, trying to understand how the rules of war should be applied, to a certain extent, flow from that. So in the philosophy of just war and in international warfare and the laws that apply, international humanitarian law that apply to warfare, so they have two categories. There is the category of jus ad bellum, the morality that dictates when one can go to war in the first place, and jus in bello, which is the law that dictates, the morality that dictates the conduct of the war itself. And in international humanitarian law and in philosophy, these two are kept separate completely, that they're evaluated each on their own terms. Is there justification to go to war, jus ad bellum? And how is the war being conducted? Is it being conducted in an ethical, moral way, jus in bello? My sister once commented that a book about halacha and ethics of war could be called Jus in bello. So the idea that these two systems are looked at completely separately and not in connection with each other, to me, sounds a little strange. The International Red Cross explains that it's necessary for legal reasons because if we were to maintain any connection between the two or any differentiation, that if you have a different justification for the war in the first place, so then the rules within the law within the war should be different, so then everyone will simply claim they have a justification. So that's the explanation officially for why they're looked at separately. Still sounds a little bit flimsy. So for example, if one understands, let's say, that Russia invading Ukraine is an unjustified war to begin with, they don't have the right to do that to start with, so then presumably there's no kind of way of conducting the war that will be ethically appropriate because it all flows from an unjustified decision to begin with. So the idea that these two questions can be completely disconnected from each other, somewhat hard to understand. And indeed, Jewish law doesn't actually disconnect them and assumes that there is always a direct line between the justification for the war and how that war is conducted, because there's going to be a difference, that there's going to be an association. So therefore, understanding what the war is based on in the first place will affect the details of the ethics of the war, and therefore the concept of Milchemes Mitzvah, of a war that's justified by defensive needs, is going to impact how the details play out. So within that, the question of compassion and mercy within warfare, within conflict, becomes a major, major discussion. Now, the Torah has a fascinating commandment, which, once again, is way ahead of its time in terms of the whole approach to warfare. We read it just a few weeks ago in Parshas Shoftim, where the Torah tells us that in a conflict of a war between nations, between the Jews and other parties, first, before entering into battle, v'karasa le'al shalom. You should first call out to them and try to make peace. Try to avoid the war in the first place. Do whatever you can to try to create a settlement and agreement so that the war doesn't have to happen. And here it's a discussion which types of war that applies to. But Maimonides, in his formulation, he assumes it applies to all wars, even to the war against Amalek, even to the most seemingly necessary wars. The Rambam maintains that there is this obligation to call out for peace first, to try to make an overture so that the war shouldn't have to happen in the first place. And there is an assumption that many of the Rishonim have, many of the commentaries have, that that overture to peace is not a one-time comment, not a one-time move at the beginning, but it dictates the entire conduct of the war in and of itself. So there is a rule which is really associated with one Talmudic authority, but seems to be accepted as binding halacha by many of the later codifiers. And that is the idea that when there is a siege on a city, so then the fourth wall has to be left open, that there has to be a route for escape, and you can't close the city completely. You can't make the enemy totally trapped. You have to allow for a route of escape. So this is the opinion of Rav Nassan in the Medrash. It's not clear whether or not there's others who agree with him, but it's at least the opinion of Rav Nassan. And when it comes to the later codifiers, Maimonides and others accepted this as the bottom line. And notably, the Sefer HaChinuch saw this as the extension of this idea of calling out for peace, that this is a mentality and a value that expresses itself in this way, with other kinds of actions as well. And Nachmanides, the Ramban, says this is its own commandment, that the Rambam should have counted this as one of the 613 mitzvos, that this is its own obligation, that there has to be an escape route so that the enemy population is not forced into a complete siege, but has the ability to escape should they choose to do so. And he suggests that there are two distinct reasons why this is. Now, one reason is because we have an obligation to express compassion even on our enemies in wartime, and therefore this has to be made possible, similar to the Sefer HaChinuch, linking it to this idea of calling out for peace. The other reasoning he gives, possibly related, possibly distinct, is that you don't want to back the enemy into a corner where there's no choice, either fight or die, because then the war is far more vicious than it would be otherwise, and there's a much more death and destruction on both sides. And in America, we know this from experience. This past summer was the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that very difficult decision was made in Washington, D.C. following the Battle of Okinawa. And that battle was so ferocious that the casualty count was so high that the assessment was that if there needed to be a land invasion of Japan, there would have been millions of casualties on both sides. And that was a recognition of just how ferocious a fight can get when there's no choice, essentially, fight or die. So the Ramban already anticipates this and suggests that that's also part of the reasoning why there should be a fourth wall open. So there was a major discussion. So what kinds of wars does this apply to? If there is such an obligation, does this apply only to discretionary wars where there's a little bit more of a question of how exactly they should be conducted? Or is it including also necessary wars of self-defense? This was a matter that seemed to be debated among the Rishonim, different languages that you find in the formulation of Nachmanides and the Sefer HaChinuch, but many read Maimonides to be saying it applies to all wars. And that posed some difficult scenarios. So, for example, the Merkeves HaMishnah So this Merkeves HaMishnah is an instruction in the falsity of stereotypes, because Merkeves HaMishnah was Rav Shlomo of Chelm, and he can testify that he was quite a smart man. And he raised the objection that if you do the math there, who's also a mathematician, if you put all the parts together, so it comes out that even a defensive war, which is a Milchemes Mitzvah, even if people are trying to kill you, you still have to have this rule of having a fourth wall open and allow them to escape. He found that very difficult to apply. And some later commentaries, the Sefer Derech Yeshara, that was written by Rav Lau Sr.'s father-in-law, by Frankel, and there's a parallel responsum in the writing of Rav Shua Menachem Ehrenberg, the Tshuvas Dvar Yehoshua, was a dayan in Tel Aviv. They both assume that the narrow categories of Milchemes Rishus, Milchemes Mitzvah, are not so helpful in figuring out when this rule applies. It may depend more on what exactly are the needs of the battlefield situation. Is it about defending from terrorists? Is it about something more functional? And whether or not it is possible to fully balance the defense of the innocence of the nation with the compassion for the enemy and allowing them to escape at the same time. So this was a major debate, and it was an analysis that went on for centuries, and a display of this constant sensitivity, trying on the one hand to balance the necessary defense of the nation with this mandate of compassion, which is the defining attribute of the Jewish people, and assessing how can they both be brought together and harmonized. And it was a debate that continued throughout, even until this generation and recent generations. And in 1982, when the war on Lebanon was taking place and there was a siege on Beirut, the chief rabbi at the time, Rabbi Goren, insisted that it not be a complete siege and that there be a fourth wall open to allow the terrorists, the PLO, to escape. And Rav Shaul Yisraeli, who was a tremendous scholar, a tremendous Talmid Chacham of the Zionist camp, so he disagreed. He said this isn't the kind of war to which it applies, and here these are all terrorists who are trying to kill us. They both agreed that we have to do whatever is possible to allow non-combatants to escape, and the whole debate was only about whether this should apply to the terrorists themselves. Should there be a route created to allow them to escape? So this debate continued on for the decades that followed, and is relevant in the current era as well. But it's important to appreciate that in the current conflict, so Israel has to grapple with a unique, unprecedented situation. Because here they would very much like to allow certainly all the non-combatants to escape the battlefield, and there's prevented from doing so by Egypt, which has the other side of the border, and the nations of the world as a whole are contributing to that denial of allowing the non-combatants to leave. So it moves to the next level, and the idea of providing sustenance and providing nutrition and humanitarian aid to people who are forced to stay there against the will of the defending party, against Israel's will, is a unique challenge which is unprecedented. And it's clear that that's not what was expected in what Rav Goren described. He says so explicitly. It's not what was expected in other literature on the subject. Rav Shelat has a sefer about this in which he discusses this at length. Rav Asher Weiss has an essay about this. So this is an unprecedented challenge which Israel has taken on, and it is a phenomenal thing to consider, just what is being addressed here, to not only try to protect the civilian population as much as possible, but also to feed them while you're being shot at by the population that's also holding hostages and perpetuating the war at the same time, is an unbelievable thing to consider. And this is something that is essentially unprecedented in world history, in the history of warfare. And this is a part of the challenge that the modern IDF and Israeli government is grappling with. But this is a part of what the Jewish people have always grappled with, trying to balance these two obligations in a way that sometimes is defiant of really any kind of logical approach. So we find that this balance is enormously tricky, and some note, the Sefer Sam Derech, the Shiva of Chevron, Simcha Zissel Broid, he noted that if you read the verses in Parshas Shoftim, that the context of this mandate, you find interwoven with each other, you find the obligation to call out for peace and the obligation to show compassion to the enemy that the Ramban sees there, and even the obligation to be protective of the trees that are not combatants. All they're mixed in together, one line after the other, with the obligation to be absolute in defending against the threats against the nation. And it's as if what we're being told here is there's always going to be a constant tension, a constant push and pull between these two priorities. And the nature of a violent world is that it's going to be enormously difficult to balance the two, and perhaps dauntingly and maybe even impossibly so. And nonetheless, we strive to do as much as we can to try to bring them into harmony and try to accommodate both of these very, very different goals at the same time. And that essentially is the glory of the Torah's message and of the people, the descendants of Yaakov, who strive to make that possible. But we recognize also that this quality of mercy, which is so crucial and so defining of who the Jewish people are, can also be abused and can also be manipulated, and that is the calling card of the terrorist, that is majorly what we mean when we talk about asymmetrical warfare. And allowing that to happen is itself a deviation that's so significant that it takes compassion out of its role in the world. And therefore, at the same time as we are obligated to maintain our own internal sense of compassion, we are also obligated with equal force not to allow that quality of compassion to be abused, to be manipulated, to allow the moral judo to take place where our own sense of compassion and the world's sense of compassion is used so that greater harm, greater terrorism and greater murder and violence can be inflicted in its name. That would be the greatest perversion, and we're obligated to guard against that. And we're obligated to make sure also that, especially in an asymmetrical propaganda battlefield, where there's only one side that is holding itself to any kind of a standard, and the difference between the two is like night and day, literally, like good and evil, quite literally, and to allow the discourse of the world to portray things so that that gets lost is the ultimate assault on morality. And it's crucial for us that we make sure that the international conversation isn't allowed to maintain that tone as much as that is the effort and as much as that is the pressure. So that places a tremendous responsibility on the Jewish people to be on the defensive, in that information war, equally as they are on the battlefield, and to recognize that our own efforts and commitment to morality and compassion are internal obligations, but can't be allowed to be used as a club against both the lives of the Jewish people and of the world as a whole that's seeking to defend itself against terrorism and against the very concept of morality. And there is an interpretation of the mitzvah of Shiluach HaKen that we read about also recently, where some of the Achronim explain that we're told to send away the mother if we take the eggs, because the instinct of the mother is to have compassion on its children, and therefore it's going to allow itself to be vulnerable as it seeks to protect the eggs when they're being taken. And one might think, okay, I can exploit that instinct, and I can take advantage of that to take the mother at the same time as well. And the Torah tells us, God forbid, we should ever indulge such an instinct, that move and that reflex towards compassion has to forever be protected. And therefore we see that also on the world stage, that this tool of terrorism to try to manipulate compassion and morality against those who seek to internalize those qualities can never be allowed to succeed, and that's an equal responsibility of the Jewish mission. And we find also that the Torah, again in Parshas Kiseitze, tells us, "V'nishmarta mikol davar ra," that we have an obligation to avoid Lashon Hara, to avoid speaking badly, and notably, that's in the context of warfare, that's placed in the context of going out to war. And that interpretation, that it's about evil speech, that it's about defamation, actually comes in the Talmud from Rav Natan, the same Rav Natan who is the one who said there's an obligation to open up a fourth wall and have compassion on the enemy. And Nachmanides, the same Ramban who codifies that as a directive, says that we have to beware of how we talk about each other in the context of war, because we can do more damage to each other than even the enemy can. So it's crucial to recognize this same pair of Nassan and the Ramban working together, recognize both values equally at the same time, that yes, it's crucial to have compassion on the enemy, but also to recognize that that can't come at the expense of the defense of the nation, and that can't come at the expense of the internal cohesion of the nation, who may tend to attack each other and do more damage to themselves at that time, do more damage to their own nation than even the enemies can do. Recognizing that danger is a crucial message that has to be internalized as well. And it's noteworthy that even if we have to prioritize one value over the other at times, and the defense of the Jewish people and of the world, really, essentially, who are being defended on the front line by the state of Israel at the moment, because the entire world is vulnerable if terrorism is allowed to win, and essentially the methods of evil are allowed to prevail. So the requirement for an absolute defense against that has to be prioritized. But that can come together with the internal work of maintaining the compassionate instinct. And there is a fascinating medrash that tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu, after he destroyed the tablets, after he threw down the luchos, so he's then commanded to make the second set in Parshas Ki Sisa. And in contrast to the first set, which God himself made, Moshe makes the second set. And the language, the Torah is, Psal luchas shnei luchos avanim karishonim. You should make this second set of luchos yourself. And the Medrash comments that God is essentially saying to him, you should make this second set of luchos. You should know what goes into making luchos that you so casually just threw off the side of a mountain. They don't grow on trees. You should know what goes into them. And it's a very striking comment, because it sounds like it's some kind of a criticism of Moshe for destroying the luchos. And we know that our attitude is that he did the right thing. And elsewhere, the Talmud tells us in a more often cited comment, you were right to break the luchos. So the great ethicists explain they can both be true, that sometimes there's a harsh decision that needs to be made, but that doesn't mean that we are immune from becoming sensitive to the consequences of that harsh decision. So essentially, Moshe is being told, you were right, you had to break those luchos, and you also had to know what went into them. You also had to know what the cost of those luchos are, and both can coexist. An awareness of the cost and the taking of that decision at the same time can coexist together, and one doesn't detract from the other if the proper attention is paid. And that is the internal mission that essentially is the ongoing obligation of the Jewish people. And we'll just note in closing that Rishol Yisraeli, who we mentioned before in a different context, so he has a very lengthy essay trying to understand this question that we started with about the ethics of warfare and how it could be that there is a different moral system that is applied in that context. And he suggests that essentially it's international convention, that since countries have always dealt with their differences through warfare, so essentially it's as if that is agreed upon by nations to deal with their conflicts in such a way, similar to the principle of Dina da Malchusa Dina, the obligation to respect civil law, which, as a Declaration of Independence explains, is because of consent of the governed. So if people in a country can consent to the laws, so too on an international level, countries have consented to use warfare to deal with their conflicts. But he says if that's how we understand it, so it also means that that can evolve. There can be greater morality that ultimately can develop, that convention can change. And over these past 100 years, that's what we have seen with the development of the laws of warfare and the Geneva Conventions and the laws of crimes against humanity and the like. And that reflects a ever-developing humanity that has taken on greater sensitivity and greater refinement. And the attitude of the Torah to this whole realm has led the way from day one, from the very dawn of humanity, and it continues to do so. and we continue to maintain the faith and belief in these principles, and in the hope that they can continue to be harmonized in an ongoing aspirational effort where each priority is recognized in its place. And our hope is that as we continue to do honor to each of these principles and to bring increasing levels of care and humanity and balance and compassion into a violent and brutal world, the more these efforts are applied with consciousness and with care and with compassion, they themselves become that call to peace that hopefully someday soon the entire world should hear. Thank you so much, and we should see a new year of blessing and peace.
Just want to thank Rabbi Feldman and all of you for coming. My thoughts about Rabbi Feldman's presentation is I'm amazed, I'm awed. Rabbi Feldman's a good friend of mine, but the fact that he can quote so many sources from Torah, from secular, from history, weave them all together, it's phenomenal. And the fact that Rabbi Feldman is now the assistant Rosh Kollel in the Wexner Kollel Elyon, and that all these young men can benefit from his sophistication, his tremendous sensitivity. It's really a wonderful blessing to the entire community. So I want to wish all of you a Shana Tova. Susan, thank you so much.